These are life lessons that can be applied to politics, business, because I'm a business person now. We have to be compassionate as conservatives, show that we care what people are going through. When we do that, our policy prescriptions can be very, very meaningful for people. Our solution to everything is more taxes, which also degrades the standard of living for the average Canadian. Rights are fine if I agree with you, but if I disagree with you, you have no rights. That's what we're veering towards. His whole mission, Pierre says, is I want to give power back to you. It's about more power, more decision-making, more freedom for you. And I think that's a very powerful message.
Welcome to another exciting episode of the podcast, The Thought Leader Revolution. I'm your host, Nicky Ballou. And boy, do we have an exciting, amazing guest lined up for you today. Today's guest is a committed champion of freedom, free expression, and free enterprise. He is a former minister in the Harper federal government here in Canada and in the Harris government in the province of Ontario. During his time in government, this gentleman has served as both the Minister of Health and the Minister of Industry, and he has played a leading role in helping Canada's economy roar forward into the 21st century after the most significant recession we'd had since the 1930s. I am speaking, of course, of none other than the one, the only, the legendary Tony Clement. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I feel like Elvis has entered the building or something.
He sure has. Well, really glad to have you here, my friend.
For sure. No, it's
Tony,
great. It's a great pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be on your show, for sure.
My pleasure, my friend. We're living in interesting times, aren't we? We're living in times that are unprecedented, certainly in our lifetimes. And there's been definitely an impact here in the free West and in our country of Canada on our freedom. And I wanted to bring you on the show because while this show is about thought leadership, it is about business, and we're going to spend a bit of time on that. It's also a show that champions freedom, free expression, and free enterprise. And the people that listen to this show understand that without those underpinning our society, they can't create the success that they want to create in their lives and in their businesses. So before we can get into that, though, Tony, why don't you give us your backstory? First of all, how'd you get to be involved in politics in the first place?
Well, Nicky, I'm an immigrant to this country, Canada, and I was born in the UK. My dad was a Greek Cypriot, and my mother's family hailed from the Middle East, actually, from Aleppo in Syria.
Wow.
And then they were kind of a cosmopolitan family, and my grandmother was educated by Coptic nuns in Egypt and all sorts of things. But I was born in Manchester, and my family, seeking a better life, moved to Canada, and initially Hamilton, then Toronto. And I got involved in politics at an early age, 14 or 15 years old. There was a provincial election going on in Ontario in 1975, I guess, and I got involved in that. And from there, I just sort of blossomed into a political animal. I at a time, you talk about freedom, at a time, those of us who were observing politics and getting sort of growing up in politics, that was the time of Pierre Elliott Trudeau being the Prime Minister of Canada. But more importantly, worldwide, it looked like freedom was on the run. Like these communistic regimes were taking over in Asia and Africa, Vietnam, Mozambique, Angola, Laos, Cambodia, etc. And so it did not look good for democracy and freedom in those times. And then all of a sudden, these champions of freedom, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Helmut Kohl in Germany, came forward. And then it was a time of tumultuous change in Europe with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. So that was kind of the context in which I became who I was politically, which was a person who believed in freedom of choice, who believed in free markets, who believed that more decisions made by individuals was better than government making all the decisions in our lives. And that's what sort of compelled me to get involved in politics as I did. So I started out as a volunteer. I became president of the Ontario PC Party. I then ran for office and won. and became a member of the Ontario legislature, and then in the cabinet of the Conservative government at the time. And then when change was needed in Ottawa federally, I became a part of that movement as well, and happily served as a member of Parliament for almost 14 years, and 10 of those years in the Stephen Harper cabinet. So yeah, I think it's an important question. And now, of course, these issues, much as we thought they went away with the collapse of communism, they didn't go away. And indeed, the era of big government seems to be back. And already we're seeing a reaction to that amongst younger people, millennials and Gen Zers. And I think I think we're going to see more reaction to that in the future as well.
So I had no idea that you were an immigrant to Canada, and I had no idea that your roots are in the Middle East, because I'm from Iran myself originally. My family came here when I was a teenager. So we certainly hail from the similar parts of the world. That's pretty cool. And,
it is.
You know, I remember the time of the Harris government being elected. I remember watching a debate between Mike Harris and the then NDP Premier of Ontario, Bob Rae, and I was listening to it, and Bob was an articulate, well-spoken man who spoke in complete sentences and paragraphs. And well, to put it charitably, Mike wasn't. Let's just leave it at that. But Mike spoke earnestly and from the heart, and he spoke about issues that mattered. And although I could understand what Bob Rae was saying more readily than I could understand what Mike was saying, what Mike was saying had the power of truth to it, had the ring of freedom associated with it. And I want to just speak to you as someone who was part of that revolution, part of that incredible turnaround of events, because the NDP had won quite a few seats in the 1990 election, and the Conservative Party was reduced to a really small shell of itself.
Very small, yeah.
How was it that your message was able to capture people's imagination back then?
Yeah, it's very interesting, because we as a party, we went from 20 seats in the Ontario legislature to first place. We went from third to first in one election cycle, which had only happened once before in Ontario history. So it was a big shakeup. And everyone assumed that the Liberals were going to gain government after Bob Rae's government collapsed, but it was not to be. And I think it's, as you say, part of it was Mike Harris talking to the issues that people cared about, that Ontario's taxes had been raised 22 times under the Rae government, that our welfare rates were higher than Newfoundland's. This was a proud province, Ontario. It's always seen as the economic leader for Canada, and all of a sudden things were not so rosy, and things were not looking rosy for the future. So I think Mike Harris was able to attach to that concern that people had about their economic future and their economic standing, and say, no, we need a bit of a shakeup here. We called it the common sense revolution. Yes, there was revolution in the title, but there was also common sense in the title. And it was a great way to balance it off, that, because revolutions can be scary. Let's face it, coming from Iran, that revolutions can be scary. So we didn't want to scare people by saying we need a revolution. We said, no, this is a common sense revolution. This is getting back to common sense government again. And it definitely found its audience, particularly in the suburbs of Toronto and Ottawa and other places like that. And we were able to form a majority government. So yes, I think you hit the nail on the head. And that's always the challenge for conservative governments. When and this is something I believe, and I've said this for many different places, including at the cabinet table, when small C conservatives can attach themselves to the middle class, to the hopes and aspirations of people who are striving, who want to do better for their kids, who want to make sure that they not only have economic stability for themselves, but that there is a better life for their kids and their grandkids. If conservative politicians can speak to that, then that is a way to get electoral victory. If they are detached from that, that's when the problems start for them. So, I mean, we all have kryptonite. is another saying of mine. What are the things that weaken and crush political movement? Well, for the NDP, it could be self-righteousness. For liberals, it might be entitlement. For conservatives, it might be nasty. Oh, they're nasty. They're nasty. They don't understand what you're going through. They're nasty. So that's the thing. We have to be compassionate as conservatives. We have to show that we care what people are going through. And when we do that, our policy prescriptions can be very, very meaningful for people.
What you just shared with us really is a pillar of what we call thought leadership, okay? So let me draw a distinction for you between an expert and a thought leader. An expert is someone who knows something in their area of expertise, right? There's a lot of people who are experts. A thought leader, though, is someone who's known for knowing something in their area of expertise. And one of the keys to becoming a thought leader is messaging. Your message needs to be one that is aimed at a group of people with a need, with a problem, with an acute problem, a 10 out of 10 problem that they must solve. In 1995, in the province of Ontario, the people of Ontario had lived under their first NDP government, and that had become an acute problem for them. They didn't like the government that the NDP was giving them. Taxes were raised. Traditional mores were being mocked and ridiculed. And you had, as the Minister of Finance, a fellow whose nickname was Pink Floyd Lauren. I remember him.
Floyd Lauren. Yeah,
that's right. Pink Floyd Lauren. And this fellow, he looked the part of a sober individual, but he was really pretty radical in some of the things that he wanted to do from a spending point of view. So Mike Harris and the Conservative Party understood their target market. They understood the pain they were feeling. They understood the itch they wanted to scratch. They crafted a message, and you were part of that, a message that spoke to that pain and promised to solve it. They had specific prescriptions of exactly what they were going to do. And then here's the best part. In business, you got to ask for the sale. They asked for your vote. So the party said, vote for us. And it was incredible because in 1990, I was away at university in the United States, so I didn't get to vote in that election. Back in those days, we didn't have mail-in voting, and I always used to say it's not my fault the NDP got elected. I had nothing to do with it. But I was back in Ontario.
Well, you mentioned the 1990 election, and Nikki, I was a campaign manager in that election for our candidate in High Park, Swansea. His name was Yuri Polikiewski. He's a great Ukrainian Canadian. He's actually in Ukraine right now. I actually talked to him. He's been living through all the bombardments and whatnot. But at the time, he was the Ontario PC candidate in High Park, Swansea. And I was his campaign manager. And I remember knocking on doors with Yuri. And these were, at the time, $300,000 houses in High Park, West Toronto. Now they'd be, 2 million, 3 million, who knows? But at the time, they were 300,000. And so they're fairly well-heeled people. And I go to the door and people would say, well, I'm voting NDP this time. And I would say, you realize the NDP are going to tax rich people like you. I'm not rich. They're going to tax the rich people. I'm not rich. They're going to tax other people. And I'm thinking, you've got a $300,000 house in West Toronto. The NDP are going to consider you rich, But that was one of the cognitive dissonance of the time, that everybody thought that somebody else was going to get dinged and not themselves. But when you had 22 tax hikes in 4 years, everybody got dinged.
Everybody got taxed.
And their standard of living suffered accordingly. So that was the kind of the perfect storm that allowed for some new thinking. And we tried to, Mike Harris was a determined leader. Thought leader. He learned from people in Alberta and other parts of the world about this emerging trend towards, having a different kind of government that was definitely deferential to the public. We cut the number of politicians by 30%. That was part of our platform.
That was amazing.
And one of our photo ops was in front. I think it was the first photo op of the election campaign was a flatbed truck with 30 chairs in it, rolling away saying we're cutting those 30 seats from the Ontario legislature. We'll have fewer politicians and we'll cut their gold-plated pension as well.
I remember that too.
So this was what is called populism now.
Yes.
This was pre-populism, but it was speaking to the idea that there was a disconnect between the political class and the average person. And we wanted to reconnect those again. And I think the same kinds of debates are happening right now, Nikki. And it's never a good thing when the public sees the political class as off in their own world, and whatever is good for me, you don't get to. It's not good for thee, or vice versa. And I think that's why we're having these protests and debates and so on.
Absolutely.
Because people don't think that anybody's in their corner.
And I absolutely want to get to that, but let's the point you made was a powerful one about the people hearing a message and saying, oh, it's not going to apply to me, but then they got mugged by reality. And I remember when Mike Harris came out with the Common Sense Revolution platform, a lot of the thinking and the ideas that he had were original, but there was a bunch of thinking and ideas that were borrowed from Newt Gingrich in the United States with the Contract with America, which was another very powerful populist conservative political movement that overthrew 40 years of Democratic control of the U.S. Congress. But what Mike Harris was able to do, because of our parliamentary system that Newt wasn't able to do in the U.S. to the same extent, was he was able to push his policies through. And there were two wonderful election cycles in which conservative governance was the order of the day in Ontario. But then you moved on from provincial politics and you got involved in federal politics. We'd had a situation where Jean Chrétien had been the Prime Minister of Canada, and he and his finance minister, Paul Martin, had at least somewhat done a decent job of reducing the debt and reducing spending and so on and so forth. But when Chrétien left and Paul Martin came in, some of that seemed to change. Paul Martin seemed to want to, cave to the left side of his party because he was seen as the right winger in the Liberal Party. And he started putting some policies together which weren't working. And that's when yourself and Stephen Harper decided to bring the similar type of powerful conservative messaging into federal politics. Could you take us through that for a little bit? Because I think that's instructive as well.
Well, Jean Chrétien came in on a wave of change himself in 1993 after the collapse of the Progressive Conservative government. And that led to 4 straight election wins for the Liberal Prime Minister. But by the time in the early 2000s, there was this civil war within the Liberal Party between Chrétien and his chief lieutenant, Paul Martin, as you mentioned. And Paul Martin basically kind of shabbily ejected Chrétien from the prime ministership, which led to bad feeling within that governing party. And then Martin, once he had the golden chalice of power, didn't know what to do with it. His nickname became Mr. Dithers. I don't know if you remember that, but and I had heard stories of interminable cabinet meetings where they argued and never came up with a decision on important matters of public policy. You talk about thought leaders, but you've got to be a doer as well, right? You've got to at some point make a decision. And that was not a hallmark of the Martin government. So there was winds of change happening again. Stephen Harper, unknown quantity at the time, a Western conservative, and believe me, they tried to demonize him for that. But he, here's the thing. Here's the thing. He not only had ideas how to change government and the country for the better, but he had an architecture of decision making. And what does that mean exactly? It means that he not only knew what he wanted to do, he knew which levers he needed to pull in government to actually get it done. And that's what I look for in a leader now. Anybody, a lot of people have great ideas, Nikki, but who has the architecture necessary to actually get things done in government? Because it's very difficult to move the battleship around. And Harper knew how to do that. He's probably the most extraordinary guy I've ever met in politics and worked with in politics. Let's put it that way. And so, yeah, it took a couple of tries, but he was able to win, and I ran under his banner. I ran for the leadership of the party against him. There was only three of us in the leadership in 2004. Myself, Belinda Stronach.
Yeah, I
you may remember that name.
Yes,
and well. Myself, and I was in dead last out of those three. But Harper took a liking to me, and he encouraged me to run in Parry Sound Muskoka, my Ontario riding, and I won by 28 votes in the 2006 election, which was 0.01%. It was the smallest margin in that parliament, but I won. A win is a win, and I defeated the sitting agriculture minister of the outgoing Liberal government, and we formed a government. I was made Minister of Health because I had that position in Ontario, in the government of Ontario, and he wanted people who had governing experience where he could find it. So Jim Flaherty, who was my colleague in the Ontario legislature, was finance minister in Ontario, became finance minister.
He was a great man.
Federally, John Baird, who had positions of authority in Ontario, he became the Treasury Board president initially. He had many other portfolios after that. So he was looking for people who actually had experience in governing to be on his front bench, which I thought was quite smart of him. There were others who didn't, but they learned quickly enough. And we had a platform that was simple to digest. We had identifiable goals about making sure there was less corruption, more accountability, that we were going to make some headway in healthcare provision. I was responsible for that. And it was a simple enough platform to explain. And it was also a platform that was doable to actually execute when we were in government. So, simple things like cutting the GST by 2 points.
Yeah.
The economists say, "Oh, that's a lousy policy." The economists would say, "You should cut income taxes. It's a better, more just way. Cutting the sales tax is unjust." But you know what people think? People think, I actually can see the cut in the sales tax. I actually don't feel the cut in the income tax. So for them, it was a proof point that we were serious about tax cutting, because they know every politician promises to cut your taxes. Very few actually do it when they get there. Yeah. And so ours was definable, it was executable, it was measurable, it was accountable, these kinds of things. And I think that was the beauty of that platform for Stephen Harper in 2006.
It was a fantastic platform. He did a great job from a messaging point of view, and he built a powerful brand for himself and for the Conservative Party as being the party for the common person, being the party for families, and being the party that cared about kitchen table type issues. I thought that he did a really, really good job. And then I'll just tell you my opinion. In 2015, when he ended up losing that election, I don't think he took Justin Trudeau seriously enough. I don't think he took the risk that this guy posed with some of the policy prescriptions he brought forward seriously enough, because if he had, the Stephen Harper of the 2006 election, the 2011 election would have demolished this guy. But yeah, he wasn't. He was just thinking, I'm going to cruise and I'm going to win. And it was starting to become obvious that wasn't the case. It wasn't going to be as an easy of an election, and that's too bad. And I think that's an abject lesson for our country as well as the Conservative Party. Never, ever, ever underestimate your opponents and their messaging, the power of their messaging. He had the key to his victory, in my opinion, was when he said he was going to bring freedom in one small section of society, and he was going to make marijuana use decriminalized. Mm-hmm. And he followed through on that. And there was a lot of people who, weren't maybe necessarily like, potheads or whatever, but they just thought it was ridiculous that marijuana was criminalized in terms of its use. And I think, I wish Harper at that time had said, you know what, I was wrong on this issue mid-campaign. we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it smarter than Justin's going to do it, because the way Justin's done it has just led to all kinds of nasty issues. You know, people are smoking marijuana in front of children in parks. Like I took my kids out at that time and that sort of thing. And that's why the conservatives lost. And unfortunately, that saddled us with the man who, in my opinion, is the most tyrannical leader we've ever had in Canada. That's Justin Trudeau, and the man who represents a clear and present danger to the state of freedom in the free world. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that statement, because I know that's a pretty bold and controversial statement on my part.
Yeah, no, thank you for all that. Let me say a couple of things. First of all, on your first point, my adage is you run scared or you run stupid. So you always have to run really, really hard, and you can never take your opponent for granted. And I think there was a little bit of that with Justin Trudeau in the 2015 campaign. Secondly, I think you're bang on marijuana. I think it was emblematic of it heightened Trudeau's narrative that we needed generational change in government. That these old guys don't get it, we get it. And what I noticed in my riding, Parry Sound Muskoka, despite all the rich cottages there, the actual people who live and work there year round, they're not rich. Okay, they're hand to mouth, or they're seasonal employment, or what have you. And a lot of them work in construction and building trades and so on, maybe making your deck bigger or building new cottages or that kind of thing. And I knew my riding pretty well, thinking, holy smokes, like a lot of these guys, they smoke a lot of marijuana, before, during, and after rebuilding your deck, and I thought, I'm not going to talk a lot about our opposition to marijuana legalization in my local election. So I just sort of didn't, I said, well, the important issues of the day are economic, and here's where I stand on the economic issues. I kind of bridged rather than talk about marijuana legalization. And it really pissed off the Liberal candidate at the time. She was always trying to goad me into talking about marijuana, and I just wouldn't do it, right? Because I knew my people. But and that was the Trojan horse that got him. I think that was not the only reason. I think there's a lot of other things that went wrong in that campaign, but that certainly was part of it. So where are we now? We're
a big part of it, Tony. I would argue a big part of it.
Yeah, fair deal. So your question is, where are we now? And we're with quite frankly, a leader, a prime minister who is not fit for purpose right now. We have huge economic issues. The OECD, which is the club of 21 rich countries in the world, produced a bar graph which showed that our projected growth of GDP in this country is going to be 21st out of 21 countries in the years ahead. They actually printed it in the budget, which I found peculiar, but at least they were telling the truth. Hey, we've got a great budget. By the way, we're dead last in economic growth. And Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau are making the argument that, well, that's not a fair assessment. We want people to be happy. We really shouldn't concern ourselves with economic growth that much. We want people to be happy. Therefore, here's our dental plan, and here's our pharmacare plan, and here's our childcare plan, and so on. But you have to pay for these things at some point, Nikki. You know that, and that's the fundamental conceit of the Trudeau government, that they like making grandiose statements and announcements, but they're not very good on how to pay for things or how to actually make sure that there's value for money for the taxpayer. And ultimately, the end, they hurt people, and that's really important because the bills are coming in. We're in an unsafe world. Russia, Ukraine is a prime example, not the only example. China and trade and supply chains and inflation.
And possibly China and Taiwan. You think about that.
China,
that could
Taiwan, happen. Exactly. Housing costs and how inflation is hitting our food bills. It's an uncertain, unsettling time. And really, this government doesn't have the answers to any of that. And in fact, they're focused on the environment and climate change, while commendable on one level, they actually don't have the answers to that either. And the only thing that they have is our solution to everything is more taxes, which also degrades the standard of living for the average Canadian. So I think we're in another inflection point where people are starting to really wonder. And interestingly, younger people more than older people, under 40s, are starting to really question the status quo and are saying, this is not working for me. I have a 30-year-old son, 31 in September. He can't buy a house. There's no scenario in which he can buy a house. And,
that must tick him off.
He's starting to despair about it all, and he's getting frustrated. And he's looking for politicians who are talking about the issue that he most cares about, which is housing costs and more broadly affordability. And so I think that this is where the Trudeau government is really falling down. They had a lot of, again, all hat and no cattle, as they say out west, when it came to the federal budget on the affordability issues. But really, when you dissect them, there's really not a lot of there. And I think that this is ultimately something that people are going to care about.
I wholeheartedly agree with everything you said. But if I may, Tony, I think we need to come back to first principles ahead of all that. This is a liberal democracy that we live in, Canada. We respect people's right to disagree with us, even if we vehemently disagree with what they have to say. Even people with noxious opinions in a liberal democracy should have the right to speak those noxious opinions, because otherwise you live in a tyranny. Otherwise, you're living in a country where someone gets to choose which opinions are superior to others, a little bit like Animal Farm by George Orwell of the book 1984. And our prime minister has shown himself to be a hypocrite on these issues. He's also shown himself to, quite frankly, be displaying some Mussolini-like tendencies. And I really want to get into this with you. I'm sorry that it may be an uncomfortable conversation, but I think it's an important one for Canadians to hear, and frankly, freedom-loving people all over the world to hear. When the trucker convoy started making its way from out west, from British Columbia to Ottawa, the prime minister started calling those people white supremacists, bigots, and misogynists. Now, here's an interesting thing. This is a man who has been caught wearing blackface on video and in photographs 3 times on 3 separate instances. I'm kind of thinking a man who does that and is calling other people racist really needs to shut his mouth, from my perspective. And I speak as a light brown Middle Eastern fellow from Iran, right? I wasn't born here and I don't have any English or any European in my background. So kind of it offended me that this guy wore blackface and started telling us, what he thinks we should be doing. That's number one. So I think there's hypocrisy and there's racism in this man. Secondly, he said he refused to meet with those people. He refused, and all they requested initially was a meeting with the prime minister to air their concerns about the vaccine mandate. Now, you could agree with the vaccine mandate, you could disagree with the vaccine mandate, but the job of leadership is to meet with people you disagree with, to help them see that you understand them, even if you're not going to do what they want to do. And I got to say, that's happened in Canadian history many, many times. His father would have done it. And then thirdly, this man took the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which his father wrote for us. And I got to tell you, there's an ad I want you to get Pierre to create. And it's Pierre Elliott Trudeau giving the speech saying why this is an important document, how proud he is. And then we got to show Justin tearing it to shreds. And we should have an animation of Pierre Elliott rolling in his grave over what his son did to a signature achievement. This is something that if you're a Canadian and you believe in our system of government, you believe that freedom is good, this should alarm you. And when he decided to call out the Emergencies Act, which is basically the War Measures Act, and only has ever been invoked during wartime and when the FLQ kidnapped and killed those diplomats over Canadian citizens with little children in bouncy castles in Ottawa. I got to tell you, that's Mussolini-like behavior. And I think every Canadian, conservative, liberal, NDP, should be concerned and should not vote for an individual that acts that way. And I want you to address that specifically. And I'm sorry to get so passionate about this, but this really matters to me.
No, of course, and as it should. Let me tell you the tale of two protests, just to show you exactly what your point of view illustrates. When I was in government with Stephen Harper, it's about 11 years ago now, there was mass protests throughout the country on behalf of Indigenous rights. It was called Idle No More. You may remember it.
I do.
And the focus of that became Indigenous leaders and other protesters converging on Ottawa, clogging up the street in front of the Parliament building, surrounding the Prime Minister's office, not allowing anyone to come in or out. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
And that was, I'm not saying it went for 3 weeks, but it certainly went for several days. Here's how Prime Minister Harper reacted to that. He called a meeting with the organizers. He dragged half of his cabinet to the meeting. I was part of that. We had a meeting with the head of the Assembly of First Nations, the head of the BC First Nations. Her name was Jody Wilson-Raybould. That name may ring a bell.
Oh yeah, rings a big bell.
She was invited. She was invited to the meeting. A series of Indigenous leaders, while they were banging on the door outside the Prime Minister's office, we had a meeting with them all morning. We sat there and listened as they aired their grievances. We had a little bit of a lunch break, and then all afternoon we worked on solutions. That's how Stephen Harper dealt with a protest. You can call it a blockade, you can call it a protest, a multi-day. He met with those protesters and tried to come up with solutions. And he dragged half his cabinet with him. Now, compare and contrast to what you just said about Prime Minister Trudeau, who refused to meet with them, called them a bunch of names. As soon as he called them racists and misogynists and goodness knows what, crypto-fascists, then he couldn't possibly meet with them. There was no end game that could end the protest with the Prime Minister meeting with them, because he'd called them these noxious names.
I
and
have
so
a real
that was,
problem
I think,
with what he said, though. A real problem. 45% of the trucking industry is owned by brown skin families, Punjabi Sikhs. 45%.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, they're white supremacists and racist. Excuse my language, Mr. Prime Minister, but please go screw yourself if you're going to call those people that. That's number one. Number two, they were little kids. I went to Ottawa. I was in front of the Parliament building. I saw 3 bouncy castles with 4-year-old children and mothers. The vast majority of people there were women with little children, asking them, like, are you kidding me? This is what scared you? This is what scared you, Mr. Prime Minister? Are you kidding me? Like, that's a problem. Like, Stephen Harper acted like a leader. He was willing to meet with people who disagreed with him, and he was willing to try and find common ground. Justin Trudeau acted like a petulant child, like a Mussolini-style fascist. And I'm sorry, he's the crypto-fascist. Maybe not even so crypto with this activity. And then invoking that action, freezing people's bank accounts. But by the way, caused a run on the banks. I have a friend who works at the Royal Bank. He's going to remain nameless. But he called me 2 days later and he said that the bank has sent out an internal memo saying that we're not giving any more money out. There's one on the bank. We need to steady it. This never became public news. But can you imagine that policy? What so many people who maybe didn't even donate money to that cause, but said to themselves, wow, they're coming after my money just because I have this political opinion.
Well, this is it, Andy. You know, our topic is freedom, and this was such an abridgment of freedom that will go down in the history as a shameful moment for Canada. I really do believe that. There are plenty of ways you could have dealt with the protest within our current laws. You know, I personally think the protest went on too long, but they shouldn't have honked their horns all the time and all those things. But you know, you don't need the invocation of the Emergencies Act, which, as you said, the last time that act was invoked in its previous form was in 1970, when the FLQ were delivering letter bombs to English residences in Montreal, and kidnapped the deputy premier of Quebec and killed him, and kidnapped the high commissioner for the UK. You know, these were serious acts of terrorism. There was nothing similar to that in the trucker convoy protest. So yes, I agree with you. It shows a casualness to rights and freedoms. Rights are fine if I agree with you, but if I disagree with you, you have no rights. That's what we're veering towards, and you see that in their internet regulation bill as well, where they're seeking to divide content into content that is acceptable and content that is unacceptable, decided by government. This is not a free and democratic society when you do those sorts of things, quite frankly. And fortunately, because I've been worried about this for 6 or 7 years. When you look at research from 6 or 7 years ago, people 18 to 30 were seemingly fine with the idea that if you were saying something that they viewed as obnoxious, you weren't allowed to say that. Cancel culture at its worst. Yes. Now, what we're finding with the Pierre Poilievre campaign is the people that are most vociferous and most emotional about standing for freedom are young people, 20 years old, 25 years old, 30 years old, who feel that their freedom has been abridged. They've seen where this is leading. First we come for the other guys, then they're going to come for me. And they don't want to live in that kind of society. So I think this is actually a moment of hope when I see all these young people coming out to the rallies and the meet and greets for Pierre Poilievre. That to me is a sign of hope for the future, actually.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And the reason the young people are the most vociferous opponents of the tyranny of Trudeau is because they've got the most to lose. They've got the longest runway of life left over. Let's face it, men like you and I'm 54 years old, you're 60 years old. How much life do we have left? Maybe 30 years, 35 years at the most. And we're in a position that if things get bad enough, we've got options. Other people don't have those options. The young have to stay here and they have to fight. And that's why I believe in what you're doing and what Pierre Poilievre is doing so much. And that's why I've done, for the first time in my life, I've officially come out and endorsed someone for political office on my show. I've never had a politician on the show. I've never done this before. And I'll tell you, I didn't ever think I would, but I'm doing it now. I'm officially endorsing Pierre Poilievre for Prime Minister. Not because I don't think there's other good people that are out there that are running. I think there are. But I think he's got the best chance of helping preserve freedom in Canada. And his message of making Canada the freest country in the world touched me at heart. I feel like I'm a youngster. And I believe that I have a responsibility, not just to myself, but to the next generation, to my sons. I've got a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old. I want them to live in a free country. And Ronald Reagan once, in one of his speeches, said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. It doesn't get passed over into the bloodstream. It's got to be nurtured. It's got to be fought for. It's got to be cherished. It's got to be prized. Otherwise, there'll come a day where people will say that, there was a time in this country, the United States, where men and women were once free, but that time is not now. And I think you could just take out the words the United States and you could insert Canada, and that applies to the situation we're living in right now. This isn't a normal set of times. This isn't a normal period. The next election won't be a normal election. It's probably the most consequential election in the history of this country. And if we don't elect the right person to lead our country to freedom, we're screwed. All the things that our forefathers fought for are going to disappear. Good men and women, mostly men, but some women as well, have fought and died in wars for us to be free, and we've got memorials all across this great land to the sacrifice that those individuals made. And my family left Iran. We're Christian Iranians. We left Iran to come here to Canada because my father did not want his sons to grow up in a tyranny, Tony. And we cannot allow our sons and daughters to grow up in a tyranny. No way, no how. No way, no how.
Well, that was very emotional, Nikki. Thank you for sharing that. I can feel how strongly you feel about these things, and we need more of that passion in politics. There are some people in the political class who are snickering at Pierre for his freedom message. Why is he talking about freedom? We have freedom. They don't have freedom in Ukraine. We have freedom here. That's conflating. First of all, that's conflating two different issues. We should be on the side of Ukraine. But secondly, you never stop striving for rights and freedoms if you feel that they're under attack. Just because it's worse somewhere else in the world doesn't make you want to be content with what we have here. You have to continue the debate and continue the exchange of views, the free market of ideas that I believe in, that you believe in. We're not going to agree on everything, but let's debate it out. And there are some people who are afraid of that, and they seem to be very afraid of Pierre's message of freedom, and are trying to diminish what he's doing. Well, just because he got 2,000 people out in Kelowna, BC, that doesn't mean anything. Well, yeah, it means a lot, actually. It means that people are voting with their feet and are coming out to hear his message, and they're not going to listen to mainstream media if they're trying to cut Pierre Poilievre down. So, yeah, I think this is a very important moment. And Pierre, he's chosen his moment well. I guess he didn't know there was going to be a leadership race. None of us did. That was as a result of a caucus vote on the previous leader. But he seized the moment. And I believe Pierre really represents this underground view that was not being represented in the halls of Ottawa. That people are feeling this. They're feeling it economically on these issues of affordability and so on, but they're also feeling it in their hearts that now is the time to seize the moment in a democratic way. I want to make that clear for your listeners and viewers to talk about freedom and to gain more of it. And Pierre's point has been, and I've seen him several times now say this. Look, I don't want power for me. His whole mission, he says, Pierre says, is I want to give power back to you. This movement is not about more power for me. It's about more power, more decision making, more freedom for you. And I think that's a very powerful message.
It's a very powerful message, and it's one that we need. We need someone that we can believe in. We need someone that's got hope. Listen, I've watched this man for years. I've watched him get up in Parliament and speak out against Justin Trudeau, and he's been the most effective, articulate defender of freedom that we've had. And I went to a rally of his in Toronto. I've never gone to a Canadian political rally before, and it was incredible. The place was full. You had young people there, you had older people there, you had people of all nationalities, races, creeds, you had straight people, you had gay people, you had everyone and every kind of human being out there, every kind of Canadian out there. And what was beautiful about it was that we were all united by one thing, that we believe Canada's a special place, we believe freedom matters, and we believe we need to fight for it. And there's people in there that are going, look, there's a lot of politicians who've let us down. Let me be frank. The last conservative leader campaigned as a true blue conservative to get his job. And then when he became the leader of the party, he became liberal light. So that wasn't great. And I'm believing Pierre won't do that. I'm believing Pierre is going to campaign as a freedom lover, and he's going to campaign in the general election as a freedom lover, and he's going to act that way because that's who he's been all his life. But you can understand why a lot of people have a little bit of cynicism towards politicians. And we're living in a time where you got to make sure that you deliver on your promises to the people.
Well, and this goes back to my point about the architecture for governing. And I think Pierre Poilievre, if he's successful, will be the first leader we've had since Stephen Harper who actually knows not only what he wants to do, but how to get it done. And that's a big advantage that you have if you can do that, because otherwise it's chaos. And people vote for change, my friend. They don't vote for chaos.
No, they sure as heck don't. I'll tell you what, Tony, I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. It's been a fantastic conversation. We end off each and every single one of our episodes by asking you as our guest expert to give us what I call your 3 expert action steps. These are your best pieces of advice for my listener to be able to take their life, their business, our special country of Canada to another level? So what do you say?
Well, I take it very philosophically and say these are life lessons that can be applied to politics, business, because I'm a business person now, and life in general. Number one, don't give up. You're always going to face adversity, and it's how you suffer through adversity and get to the other side. It's all well when people are throwing rose petals at you. When they're throwing bricks, that's when you find out what you're really made of. So I think that's really important. The second thing is hope is not a strategy. When you have goals in mind, and we have goals for our country, we have goals for ourselves. I fall for this sometimes. I always hope that things go my way or the country's way, but you've actually have to be a thought leader. You've got to have the strategy. How are you going to get this done? That I think is incredibly important. And I would just say, have grace in your life. We don't hear a lot of people talking about grace these days, but I think people are going through stuff. We've gone through a terrible time with the pandemic. Be understanding, be compassionate. We talked a lot on your show today about power, which is important, and politics is important. Love and compassion are even more important. And if you have that in your everyday life, in your business life, in your social life, in your political life, I think you'll be a better person. So those are my three.
Tony, those are three incredible expert action steps. I absolutely love them. And I'm going to add a fourth on your behalf. If you're not already a member of the Conservative Party, join and make sure that you're registered so that you can vote for Pierre in the upcoming leadership. I think that's very, very important. I think we all need to do that. And listen, if you're a Liberal or an NDPer and you've never considered voting Conservative before, and the idea of it bothers you, but you're even more bothered by how the current government has been abrogating all our freedoms, and you can't see yourself allowing this to continue, I'm going to tell you this: hold your nose, go online, register as a conservative.
Conservative.ca.
Don't do it because you're a partisan. Do it because you're a patriot and you love this country and you can't see it go down the tubes and become a place that men and women will say, we remember a time where at one point men and women in Canada lived free, but that time is not now. Don't let this happen. This is how important this is. Do whatever you have to do to make this happen. And I'm reaching my hands across the philosophical aisle, as it were, to bring in those disgruntled NDP and Liberal voters who really understand that what's happening in our country right now cannot be allowed to continue. Let's have you come on board. Maybe you won't be a Conservative forever, but maybe just for this season, it's the right thing to do. So let's make it happen.
So that's conservative.ca. You're absolutely right. After you've done that, you can download the back podcasts of Nikki's program. And after you've done all of that, you can also download my podcast, which is called And Another Thing Podcast. You can find that wherever you listen to podcasts, or go to andanothingthingpodcast.ca.
I'm going to give that a listen. I haven't done that yet, so I'm committing to you that I'm going to do that. I'm excited to go check out your podcast. It's going to be great. You're a very articulate, thoughtful man. Thank you for coming on the show. I really, really appreciate it, and hopefully we can get Mr. Poilievre on the show as well. And let's get him speaking directly to the audience. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
Fantastic.
And that wraps up another exciting episode of the podcast, The Thought Leader Revolution. To find out more about today's incredible guest, the one and only Tony Clement, please go to thethoughtleaderrevolution.com or wherever you happen to listen to this episode, be it iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Audible, Google Play. Until next time, goodbye.
This episode has been brought to you by eCircleAcademy.com, the proven system to add 6 to 7 figures a year to your thought leader practice.